Chapter 2. Melius stood by the abandoned campsite, observing his surroundings. 2 logs were deliberately arranged as seats close to a small, makeshift fire pit, and flattened mats of grass hinted at the length the campsite had been used. He bent down and rubbed the ashes from the fire between his fingers, noting the fish bones scattered around the pit. A distinct fingerprint lay on the area, a feeling and an aroma that was more than familiar to him. The faint fragrance dallied briefly between his nostrils before disappearing in a light breeze. His eyes followed the footprints heading east in the direction of the mountains. He'd been traveling for several hours without stopping. Hunger pains stabbed at his stomach, and his muscles begged for a respite. But his quarry, now that he knew they were so close, was too important. There'd be no rest for the weary now. "Well, Mr. Robert Black," Melius glared impatiently at the latter, "you've given me an adequate description of my little fugitives, and have led me here, where you saw them last. But this information is hardly worth a reward. I want them within my grasp, not their whereabouts from hours ago." Melius shrugged his cloak off his shoulders, revealing an intimidating variety of weapons. Softly, he placed the palm of his hand on his knife's handle. "You've wasted my time, and you're squandering my patience." "I ain't wasted your time, sir." Black's breathing accelerated, and he raised his hands defensively. I can lead you to them." "You think I need you to find them?" "I know what they look like." The blade flew so quickly that Robert didn't even notice it until it had landed with a twanging thud in front of his foot. "So do I." The end of the knife was still quivering from the impact when Robert blurted, "I was hunted here for years. Shortcuts to all the water. I know them. If they be thirsty, I'll help you catch 'em." "Shortcuts, huh? They're hours ahead of us. What good will a shortcut do?" Black smiled crookedly. "They's on foot, m'lord. You's got a horse. I knows where they're headed, and how's to get there faster." "All right, I'll humor you. Lead the way." Kessa was relieved when they'd finally found water. She was not only starving, but parched as well. Stooping to the stream's edge, she sipped the delicious, cool water. She'd barely swallowed 2 mouthfuls when the hairs on the back of her neck rose and her skin prickled. The calm, peaceful atmosphere succumbed to a building, ominous tension. "Aquestria," she whispered, "we're being watched." "It's Black," Aquestria replied quietly, pouring gravel out of one of her boots. "It's his smell," she answered the unasked question of how she knew. "Have another drink, and we'll be on our way." "There's going to be a change in that plan, my dear," a deep, distinctive voice declared. The owner of it emerged from behind a group of lilac trees, their blossoms and leaves brown and brittle. An inexplicable aura of transcendence hovered about him, making him the sort of man who didn't draw attention or notice unless he wanted to. Every aspect of his appearance was dark, dark hair, dark eyes, dark leather armor, dark knee boots, and a dark cape drawn back over his shoulders. He stood at approximately 6'4", with a lean, muscular build and attractive features. His stubble beard, short-trimmed mustache, and sparse patch of beard just below his lower lip enhanced those features, particularly the acuity of his eyes. Even though his presence whittled away all hope of escape, and even though she detested him, Kessa couldn't deny a shudder of awe. He was an impressive specimen that seemed to have a disparaging edge over his species. Her skills, none too shabby, were nothing to his. He was the patient, agile jaguar to her crafty raccoon. Enigmatic expression on his handsome face, he assessed the two girls as they, in turn, assessed him. The silence was charged with the undercurrent of anticipation and danger. Casually, Malleus waved his loaded crossbow in the direction of Aquestria's sword that was resting on a nearby stump. "Have my teachings been forgotten? A weapon should never be out of reach." "Methinks you weren't a very good teacher," Kessa declared, taking a defensive stance in front of her sister. "Ah, Miss Kessa Decora, our resident fugitive. Has Equestria regressed so much that she needs you to shield her?" His tone was accusatory. "I don't know why I find that surprising, when she's exposed herself to your parasitical, problematic presence for this long." Kessa shifted, her body language conveying her struggle to navigate the best reaction to his insult. Malleus didn't wait for her to respond. "You look stunning, the both of you, with your wind-blown hair and rosy cheeks. It does get chilly on these mountains, doesn't it?" "Spare us the preamble," Kessa snapped. "Oh, of course, you're in a hurry. Forgive me. I gather you want me to get to the point of my visit." Kessa brandished her dagger, pointing it toward the dungeon keeper. "We're not going with you. Leave us alone." A brisk wind caused shriveled leaves to crackle and almost relinquish their resolve to stay attached to their branches. Their protest underlined the young blonde's command, "Go away." Pretending to be affronted, Malleus directed his attention toward the stream. "Although I want nothing more than to acquiesce to your will, Miss Decora." He almost managed this statement without sounding sarcastic. "Your will doesn't supersede the king's." He triggered his crossbow. "Case in point, and the point of my visit." The arrow whistled through the air and found its mark, Kessa's dagger. The missile impacted the steel, glancing off and tearing skin off her hand. The dagger fell to the ground with a thud. Sucking in a sharp breath of surprise and pain, Kessa instinctively grabbed her hand. Malleus shouldered the crossbow. "An interesting thing about pain." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a length of rope. "The lesser is virtually forgotten with the greater." Methodically, he tied a noose at the end of the rope while he spoke. "You'll forget all about that scratch once you're dangling by the neck. And though I have no personal experience of this, other than being an eyewitness, I believe the pain only dies when you do." Testing the noose's strength, he concluded his train of thought. "So, if you're going to hang, you want it to be quick." He spared a repentant glance at Equestria who was stunned. Under his spell, she hadn't moved or spoken since his arrival. "You're probably wondering why I'm preparing a noose and talking about hanging Miss Decora." He glanced up at the tree branches, searching for a suitable one for the task. "Or have you figured it out? The king has, unfortunately, changed the details of Miss Decora's warrant. No longer interested in her arrest, he's hired me to hunt her down and execute her." Malleus threw one end of the rope over the sturdy branch he'd selected. "I admit, I took my time considering his offer." He paused, probably because even he could hear how insincere that sounded. "It puts me in a difficult position, given our relationship. But when the king detailed how excruciating he wanted her death to be, I immediately accepted." "Figures," Kessa responded, ignoring the hairs on her neck and arms standing on end again. For all the resistance she gave, she might as well have been bound and gagged. Though she loathed acknowledging it, the dungeon keeper held her just about as spellbound as her older sister. She'd forgotten her bloody hand, her dagger on the ground, her determination to thwart this man at all costs, and her will to survive. "I accepted because I know that unlike anyone else, I'll show you mercy. I'll spare you the torture and make it quick." The moment he stopped talking, standing there scrutinizing her like a panther sizing up his prey before pouncing, reality crashed into her. Like an avalanche, the revelation that not only did her monarch want her dead, but excruciatingly too, and he had hired the most competent and lethal hunter in the kingdom to do it, bowled her over. On its own, the news was enough to bowl anyone over, but add the sight of blood oozing between your fingers when you suffer from a fresh blood phobia, and that's that. Kessa fainted. Resisting the urge to roll his eyes, Malleus picked up her wounded hand and evaluated it, his demeanor stern. Equestria blinked, almost rousing from her trance. "Malleus," she said, her voice steeped with sorrow. "Please." He looked at her, the sternness momentarily melting away to expose a similar sorrow as he lamented, "I wish this was any other way." A rustle from the bushes drew his attention for a second. He cleared his throat, and the unrelenting mien snapped back into place. Hooking Kessa's arms, he dragged her over to where the noose hung. He stood still, once again appearing like some awesome beast, scrutinizing its prey. Seeing that she was regaining consciousness, he said matter-of-factly, "I want to assure you both, I take no pleasure in this. None whatsoever." He grabbed a fistful of Kessa's shirt and hoisted her up as though she weighed no more than a child, and dutifully placed the noose around her neck. Peering down into her eyes, he saw her recognition of defeat. The look of despair was quickly replaced with one of bold disdain for Malleus and the fate he was imposing on her. He relished that look, not because he was sadistic, but because he admired courage in all its forms. Now, with much regret, despite being preoccupied with her impending doom, Kessa was positive she heard no regret in his tone. Pulling the opposite end of the rope, Malleus watched its struggling victim as she flew up into the air, not unlike a rabbit snatched by an owl. Frantically, Kessa clutched at the rope, trying to lessen the pressure on her neck. With her body rotating and swaying from the force of the lift, it was not an easy endeavor. "Stop!" Equestria cried, coming to her senses. "Malleus, I beg you, don't do this." "It's my job, beloved." Evaluating the expression on her face and the slackness of her posture, he scowled and yanked on the rope violently. "Is that a tear? Who's this pathetic shadow of the woman I know? The captain of the Eureit." His words were harsh, piercing, but the final phrase was spat with absolute venom. To Equestria, the episode had unfolded in slow motion, a sparring match drawn out so the combatants could work on technique. Her mind refused to accept the severity of what was taking place, until his words impacted her like a gale whipping through a willow tree. Dropping low, Equestria threw her leg against the back of his knees, successfully knocking him down. He laughed, appreciative of her dexterity. He still held the rope tightly, though. "Come, come, my dear. Surely you can do better than that. She's dying awfully quick up there." Snatching Kessa's forgotten dagger, Equestria sliced the rope between Malleus and the branch. Kessa plunged to the ground, coughing, spluttering, and clutching at the rope around her neck. Malleus sat up, tossed the defunct rope aside, and leaned against a rock, not at all fazed by the rescue. Equestria held the dagger firmly. "No one hurts my sister and gets away." Casually biting his thumbnail, he interrupted Equestria's threat. "Your sister's been declared a thief and a rascal. Not to mention your choices have made you both traitors to the crown. You know the penalty all too well." His eyes flashed with furious fire. "This was a warning, Equestria, because of our relationship. I'll give you today, but take heed. If I catch you after that, justice must be carried out." Precariously, with the aid of her sister, Kessa stood up and threw Malleus a fierce look of animosity. Equestria led her wounded sister into the trees, refusing to give Malleus the satisfaction of comprehending just how much his warning had shaken her. "Equestria, you're forgetting your sword," Malleus reminded, as he held it out to her. As she snatched her weapon, he tossed a bandage from one of his pockets her way. "Why don't you take some time and wrap your sister's wound, love? She might faint again if you don't." He winked at her. Wobbly, Kessa jerked her arm away from her sister, insisting she walk on her own. Once the girls were out of sight, Malleus reached over and grabbed the end of the rope, still hung over the branch. Rising, he clucked his tongue and began winding the rope with meticulous precision. "Poacher!" he called. Instantly, Robert Black emerged from his hiding spot behind a bush. "Don't let me catch you poaching again. Understand? For your trouble." Malleus flipped him a gold coin. After his eyes had roved over the scrawny excuse for a human being, he tossed him 4 more coins to ease the poacher's reformation. Eyeing the coins in disbelief, Robert stuttered out his thanks. He ducked back into the trees, amazed at how lucky he was to leave with his life, never mind 5 gold coins and 1 dandy story to tell. Finished gathering the rope, Malleus packed it, mounted his horse, resecured his crossbow, pulled his hood over his head, and vanished into the leafy wood. Hovering protectively behind her sister, Equestria waited until they'd traveled a safe distance. Then, knelt down to adjust her boot, which had been pulled on hastily when Malleus appeared. Her lips puckered in vexation when she noticed how badly her hands were trembling. She resisted the urge to swear out loud, though plenty of curses were funneling through her mind. Upon hearing a soft sob from her sister, she rotated, her face furrowed in frustration. Seeing Equestria's furious expression, Kessa assumed it was because she'd failed dismally to hide the fact that she was crying. Though her tough persona had been perfected, she was deeply sensitive. She'd never mastered suppressing her emotions, markedly so when compared with her sister, who basically switched her emotions on or off as needed. She certainly never let them get in the way. "I wish I was more like you, Addie," she admitted, wiping her tears away and sniffing. She, like her father, often used the nickname Addie for her sister. It was a combination of her first initial and the de from Decora. "You're so clever, so in control, so brave. I'm pathetic." She winced as a jutted twig skimmed her sore hand. "Nonsense. Didn't you see how Malleus played me?" Softening her expression, Equestria put her arm around her sister. "A marionette. That's what I was. You had the courage to stand up to him." "Yes, and look what it got me." Kessa held up her injured hand acrimoniously. The bleeding had stopped, leaving dark red blotches and angry red smears around the wound. "I should have kept my mouth shut. It might have turned out better." "I doubt it." Equestria helped her sister to a semi-comfortable seat on an old log and decided to avoid discussing the dungeon keeper's damning revelations. A confrontation with the dungeon keeper was bound to be a traumatic experience, one way or another. "How do you feel?" "I'm trying not to," Kessa marveled, albeit with a queasy stomach, at the cut. It occupied her mind, distracting her from more serious problems. "It's quite deep. I'll wrap it for now." She took the bandage Malleus had tossed her out of her waist cincture, where she'd hastily stuffed it. "Then, when we get to Aquina—" "If we get to Aquina," Kessa pointed out, silencing her sibling. "Honestly, how are we going to get anywhere with that beast on our trail?" Equestria sighed. "Malleus is an awesome tracker, I'll give you that. But he has his weaknesses, and who better to know them than his own wife?" Scowling, Kessa declared, "I curse the day you married that man." Equestria rolled her eyes toward the sky, and her jaw muscles tensed with the knowledge of what was coming. "I distinctly remember warning you not to marry him, and very strongly, I might add." Kessa inhaled sharply as her sister pulled the bandage a little too tightly, and wisely decided to wait ere pressing the issue further. Once finished the wrapping, Equestria peered around the woods, collecting her bearings. "How's your neck?" she asked. "Oh, you mean other than it being just agonizing to swallow or move it?" "That noose obviously didn't hinder your voice box, unfortunately," Equestria teased under her breath. Hearing the playful jab, Kessa snorted and told her sister that her neck was bruised and sore, and snarkily thanked her for asking. "I suppose only one used to such displays of violence could take the near execution of her sister so lightly," Kessa clapped back. Frowning, Equestria explained, "What good would displaying my devastation do either of us? I need to keep things lighthearted, or I'll drown in the mire of our situation." Though she'd called her out on it, Kessa understood her sister's position. Sometimes things were just too serious to be taken seriously. Determining the direction she wanted to go, Equestria began moving, followed by her sibling, who continued her lecture from earlier. "So, yeah, I told you not to marry the dungeon keeper, but oh no, Malleus Fane have a darker side than most? That just couldn't be. The warnings of a younger sister are seldom heeded. It was, 'I love him, Kessa. That is it, and that is all.'" Equestria struggled to conceal a grin as she trudged on in forbearing silence. Her sister's dramatic sarcasm was entertaining, despite the subject matter. "I pleaded, begged, but nothing could dissuade you. I suppose love is stubborn as well as blind. And you are stubborn, Addie." "Yes, I was stubborn. I regret being so stubborn." This admission shocked Kessa into a momentary silence, but like the pause between thunder and lightning, it didn't last long. Kessa was never quiet for long. "Then you're apologizing and admitting you were wrong?" she verified. Equestria hesitated, then nodded regally, and a large, smug smile broadened her sister's lips. "About some things," Equestria clarified. "Do you feel well enough to run?" The self-satisfied smirk was immediately replaced with another scowl. "I do not feel like running." "I know, dear, and if possible, I'd have it any other way. Alas, I feel it necessary, given our present situation." "Jest while you will, sister," Kessa responded to the obvious theatrics, which were overtly meant to mimic her. "One day the world will hear my masterful orations. When I become a skilled—" There was an awkward pause. "Orator," she finished, with significantly less enthusiasm than she'd started with. "Until then, we run." Kicking at a stone like an unimpressed schoolgirl, Kessa complained, "You never let up, do you? I suppose I'd better obey. I've heard what happens when you, Captain of the Eureit, are ignored." Kessa slapped her sister's arm in challenge as she leapt ahead. "Ex-captain, and what?" She sprinted after her sister, who'd already achieved a substantial lead. "What did you hear?" Her question was left unanswered. When she'd caught up, Kessa's breathing was too accelerated for speech. As they descended the mountain, the trees thinned and the air warmed. Bird song increased in breadth as well as in volume, and the ground became easier to traverse. The sky was a pretty mauve, speckled by the dim light of stars, sparkling like jewels on an evening gown. "Please, let's rest," an out-of-breath Kessa pleaded, bending over tiredly. "We've been running for a long time, and it'll be getting dark soon." "You baby, you wouldn't last a day in my regiment." Equestria smacked Kessa on the back, almost toppling her. "I guess this small clearing is as good a spot as any to sleep." "Who said I wanted to be in your regiment? Besides, you haven't been strung up like a piece of meat today, nor does your hand resemble sliced salami." "I remember a time I broke my arm, twisted my ankle, bruised my knee, and had a particularly nasty bump on my head, and I still ran longer, not to mention faster, than you." Kessa sneered at her sister's obvious and annoying exaggeration. "Well, I'm not the captain of the Eureit." After a moment, she added bitterly, "What do you expect from a garbage thief and rascal?" A frown creased Equestria's brow, her sister's comment discernibly upsetting her. "I don't want to hear you call yourself that again." "That's what I am now, Captain. Your hubby wasn't lying. Perhaps you ought to realize that." Interrupting the impending reproof, Kessa explained that she needed some space and headed for a thick copse of trees. "Don't go too far. Who knows what Malleus is really up to?" Equestria cautioned, her concern increasing as Kessa waved her hand in an apathetic gesture. Preparing a small fire, Equestria mulled things over. Were the claims of Kessa's treachery justified? Weeks had passed since she'd come home from riding and found her younger sister embroiled in a scuffle with 2 armed guards. They had immediately informed her, with some difficulty due to the altercation, that she had no authority in the matter since the accused was flesh and blood. Witnessing her sister's struggle and distress inhibited her ability to think clearly, and her protective instinct took over. Like a mother bear defending her cub, Equestria attacked the 2 guards. The 2 guards were nowhere near the captain's caliber and caved under her onslaught. Malleus had arrived home just then. After a quick explanation, completely unnecessary since the dungeon keeper had already heard about the warrant for his sister-in-law's arrest and had thus hurried home, Equestria had begged for his help. It had shocked and dismayed her when he'd rebuked her for attacking the guards and told her to turn Kessa in. When she'd refused, he'd embarked on an extensive discourse on her duty as the captain of the Excerpt, obeying the law and arresting her sister. He'd underlined how hard she'd worked, how hard they'd both worked to achieve all they had. It was simply insane to throw it all away so hastily. After listening to her further pleas, he'd informed her that if she aided Kessa, she'd be unequivocally disobeying the king's orders and endangering her own life. He just couldn't, in good conscience, help her to do that. "Let's be honest, Equestria. This isn't your sister's first rodeo. Cassius personally ordered Kessa's arrest. Think about that. The king personally wants your sister arrested." He'd paused to lend credence to that statement. "He's your boss, and a powerful enemy, my love. You shouldn't cross him. I'll take her in, if you'd prefer not to be the one to do it." Equestria snapped out of her memories and gazed up at the sky. "Great," she moaned, noting thick clouds obscuring the stars. "A storm is the last thing we need." She rose, searching the trees for any sign of her sister. Strong hands gripped her shoulders and started to massage them. She was not at a loss about to whom the hands belonged. It felt so good, so welcome, so relaxing, so caring. Oh, how she'd longed for those hands, mainly on the chilly nights when she'd lain sleepless on the cold, hard ground. Without a word, she spun around to face him. Beholding him at first, it was all she could do just to resist the urge to throw her arms around him. But then she reminded herself why he was there. Today, the head start he'd given them was apparently over. "Malleus Fane, falling for a decoy? I never thought I'd see that." He didn't reply, but stood there scrutinizing her, an unreadable expression on his face, a hallmark of his. Shortly after her comment, another man, muscularly framed, with unkempt, light brown hair, stubble, and fierce hazel-colored eyes, stepped into view. At first she was tempted to smile in greeting, but then she realized his presence wasn't a good thing. Lady Fane. Werner, she acknowledged. He ground his teeth back and forth, which she knew to be a habit brought on by stress. So you do remember me, he said, with feigned relief. It's only I thought you'd forgotten us, since you just up and left. His bitterness didn't surprise her, and she didn't blame him for it. Her sudden departure would have upset many of her co-workers and friends, Werner especially. Aside from Malleus, Werner was the toughest trainer she'd ever met. He'd been assigned as second trainer to her unit when she'd first arrived in Cyrene. Due to Malleus's confidence in her skills, she'd been advanced to an elite group of trainees right from the start. Members of the Excerpt itself were selected from the group, and hence the trainers were from the highest levels. The dungeon keeper himself was the head trainer, but because his schedule was so demanding, he had appointed a member of the Excerpt as stand-in when he wasn't available. Werner was that stand-in. He was the honest sort, never hiding his resentment of Equestria's skills, abilities, or the dungeon keeper's admiration and promotion of her. Unrelenting, sometimes cruel, and extremely competitive, he'd never shirked his personal vendetta to push her to her limits on a daily basis. One might assume she'd grow to resent him, maybe even dislike him, but this wasn't the case. Equestria relished a challenge. The harder, the better. This was something Werner and her had in common. Over time, he'd come to accept that the harder he pushed her, the better she performed, and he had to admire that. But it wasn't until she'd beaten a handful of other combatants to become captain of the Excerpt that she truly earned his respect. Opposite of what many supposed would happen when she'd won, he'd submitted himself to an albeit rocky friendship. The fact that she'd appointed him as her lieutenant undoubtedly helped. Needs must, Werner, Equestria replied to his statement about her leaving. Need? Werner queried, his voice strained. You needed to abandon your post? Us? To rescue a thief? She's my sister. Werner mocked her statement with a high-pitched, whiny tone. Then, you've broken all our hearts, Est. Finding her name too long to say as often as he did, he'd shortened it to Est, shying away from Tria, as the others had nicknamed her. Now I've got to take you and your thief of a sister in for sentencing. Malleus cleared his throat. Werner shuffled his feet in response. I know, sir, I know. It's the only reason I haven't got her in chains already. Lord Fane's given you the day, though I can't for the life of me understand why. I'll honor that. Haven't got much of a choice. He glared at the dungeon keeper. But when I get my hands on that blonde little... Werner was in the midst of making choking hand gestures when Malleus interrupted. Don't make me regret allowing you to tag along, Werner. Werner's face scrunched up with umbrage, and his body language explicitly depicted how hard he was fighting the urge to defy authority. He kept the urge confined to a single question. But don't you just hate that gutter-snipe pickpocket for destroying the captain's life? Miss Decora will get what's coming to her. Malleus's eyes zeroed in on Werner, like a ray of light through a magnifying glass. But not from you. Werner yielded with a bowed head. What were you saying about a decoy, Est? I sent Kessa on ahead and stayed behind to distract and delay you. Werner harumphed. By now my sister is in Thera. Don't you mean Aquina, my love? Melius corrected. Lord Aegeon's castle, to be exact, Werner smirked. The rest of your story is a load of hogwash. You're no decoy. You'd never leave your sister alone that long. She'd only get into further trouble without your constant vigil. Besides, a three-legged dog could run faster than that no-good pickpocket. We passed right by her on our way to you, Melius pointed out. Not that she'd notice. Observant as a stump, that one. Werner stepped closer to the fire and held his hands out to warm them. You know, if her execution wasn't pending, I'd be concerned for her. So many pent-up emotions. Neither of you will catch her. I'll make sure of that. Oh, we know you'll try, Est. While Cassius did order me to find and execute Kessa, my nets lowered for a much more valuable fish. Melius ran his fingertips gently down her cheek. Surely you know how much I miss you. Werner's cheeks reddened, but it wasn't because he was embarrassed. Secretly, deep down, hidden from anyone, he was romantic. He'd taken as much guilty pleasure from the impassioned stories surrounding the dungeon keeper and Aquestria as the rest of Cyrene. It deeply bothered him that Lord and Lady had been torn asunder thus. We all miss you, Est, he said. If you come back with us now, maybe Lord Fane could bargain for your pardon, perhaps even reinstatement. No, she interrupted, and her answer was so forceful that she realized it wasn't just Werner or Melius she was trying to convince. Angry at her momentary loss of control, she tempered her voice. I can't. Don't be so hasty, Est, please. Although his attitude had been caustic up until that point, Werner's pleading was genuine. If you don't come back now, you and your sister will both die. The dungeon keeper himself will have to cut your throats or hang you. You really want to put him through that? I, for one, hope he starts with the one who got you into this mess. I won't abandon my sister or allow the cutting of any throats by my husband's hand or anyone else's. I can't go back. I won't go back. A slight flare of Melius's nostrils indicated his displeasure, an idiosyncrasy only she'd recognize. No one else would have had any inkling there'd been a change in his composure. Werner was far more vocal with his displeasure. His tirade almost washed out her next statement. I won't go back to serving such a cruel, vile tyrant as Cassius anyway. Ignoring the flash in both their eyes at her assertion, she put her hands on her hips. Why don't you come with us? We could use your help. Even before she'd asked, she knew their answers. Melius was wily and could manipulate a stubborn mule to do his bidding, but most of all, he was rooted in his beliefs and his service to the kingdom. Werner was no different. Shaking his head, Werner tried to control his desire to simply grab her and force her back to Cyrene. Thinking of another tactic, he tried, You're his wife. You belong with your husband. Are you really so dishonorable that you disregard the vows you made, both to the kingdom of Akara and to him? Dishonorable? Aquestria's pitch rose, her cool facade slipping with the pain his accusation incited. You think me so dishonorable for protecting my only sister? She redirected her attention to Melius. And what about your vows, husband? You vowed to honor, cherish, and protect. Or did you not hear that part? Finally, she'd struck a crucial enough chord to elicit a visible reaction. Melius frowned. He turned away, not responding verbally. Werner stood there aghast. Her vehemence had startled him. Malleus hadn't been alone in having a crucial chord thrummed. And Werner, she advanced him so forcefully he backed away, almost tripping over a tree root. As far as I see it, I haven't broken my vows to the kingdom. I serve Akara. Cassius is not what's best for Akara, and we all know it. Werner closed his eyes, as if he couldn't bear to look at her or acknowledge the feelings her declaration provoked. As if testifying of Aquestria's frigid reproof, a cold wind ripped through the campsite, extinguishing the already struggling fire and sending a chill through the trio. This discussion is over, Malleus growled. A sob caught in Aquestria's throat. Silently, she took advantage of her companion's inattentiveness and disappeared into the woods. When Malleus finally turned around, he was not surprised that she was gone. Run as fast as you can, Aquestria. You're all out of chances. His warning echoed through the forest like rumbling thunder. Bounding through the trees, Aquestria paid little heed to the branches that scratched her face, neck, and arms. The encounter with Werner and her husband had seriously disturbed her, and the possibility of losing her sister forever was looming closer. Werner she could handle, but Malleus? Malleus was another story. Ever since her father Aduard had died, she'd been chiefly responsible for Kessa. She took that obligation seriously, and that had caused strain on her marriage. Not because Malleus wasn't supportive, but because she'd often found her loyalty in a tug of war. Kessa didn't like Malleus. She made no secret about that. She'd distrusted him from the start, nicknaming him malicious, and openly discrediting anything he said or did. Believing that his goal was to isolate her from Aquestria, Kessa was obsessed with foiling his plans, and consequently became very possessive of her sister, rarely missing an opportunity to drive a wedge between husband and wife. Not that there were many. Conversely, Malleus was too busy to concern himself with his malcontented sister-in-law, although he likely resented Kessa's childish antics. Aquestria was troubled by his dismissiveness, wishing he'd at least try to make some sort of peace. Maybe he had. Admittedly, she, herself, had thought this was a futile mission, even for the formidable dungeon keeper. The pair's confrontations and rivalries were infamous throughout Cyrene. Extremely exaggerated, but infamous nonetheless, as was their dislike of each other. Sure, Aquestria was frustrated by their squabbles, but she saw no way to end the quarrels without ending a relationship. Aquestria recalled Kessa arguing that no one really knew Malleus, and never would. And she was right, to a degree. His exact origins were a mystery. People simply accepted that he'd always been there, in the shadows, a man of secrets and subtlety. He was unknown, untouchable, and if truth be told, until word spread of his love for a young, talented female soldier, Aquestria, people had never paid attention, other than to fear him or revel in the obscure myths and legends encircling him. The kingdom found the story of their love as intriguing as any fairy tale, and it spread like wildfire. Indeed, aspects of a fairy tale were present. The beautiful daughter of a beloved knight that had been killed in war, rising rapidly through the army ranks, eventually attaining the highest and most coveted position in the Ariet. Not only was she beautiful, she was skilled, charming, and remarkable in her own right. And of course, the mysterious, tall, dark, and handsome lord who'd taken her under his wing and ended up falling for her, despite himself. It was the stuff fairy tales were made of. Maelius had first noticed Aquestria when she'd thwarted a robbery at a market stall in Aquina. She displayed such unique precision, effectiveness, and presence of mind while dispatching the thieves and returning the stolen goods that he couldn't ignore his desire to assist in developing her talents. Time passed slowly and sweetly as he coached, trained, and molded her into an exemplary soldier. While he'd resolved to remain impartial, eventually he couldn't deny his feelings for her any longer. On the other hand, Aquestria fell quickly for Maelius. Attractive and cryptic, with a penchant for secrecy, a talent for concealment, and a notable aptitude for manipulation, he'd intrigued her from the outset, and his attempts to maintain a strictly professional relationship had only augmented the allurement. She relished a challenge. He'd started out as her mentor, then a valued friend, then her husband. He'd been the love of her life. Now he was her enemy. How quickly life could reshuffle and confound. Taking a deep breath, Aquestria restricted the memories and grief. Right now, they'd only hinder her, and she had enough obstacles in her path already. Kessa hadn't strayed far, and since Aquestria was a decent tracker herself, she located her easily. "What should we do?" a mortified Kessa asked after her sister had filled her in. Secretly, she'd eavesdropped on the entire meeting, observant as a stump. Ha! "Go to Aquina." "But they know we're headed there." Her entire body slumped as she unhappily acknowledged. "Maelius knows everything about us. We might as well surrender." "I'd rather go down fighting, and since you're my sister, then you've already come this far. I know you feel the same. At any rate, I'm hoping they'll expect us to change our plans now. Regardless, Aquina is the only place we can hope for aid. Pantheus alone can help us now. We need to hurry, Kessa. If Maelius or Werner sees us again, we're dead."